This mid-century modern double gooseneck desk lamp has been in my wife's family for at least 60 years. When I first started the project, I thought it would be a quick one, and it turned out it was a lot more involved than I had anticipated. The lampshades are made out of fiberglass, and they have burlap embedded in them, I think to give it a more natural look. But over time, the burlap has really deteriorated. And honestly, I saw so much burlap in the early 1970s that I decided to make new lampshades. The base is cast steel with a brass coating, but the brass is scratched up and corroded. The wiring's not that tricky on this lamp, but I did use a still shot of the video to help me create a diagram so that I could remember what was connected to what. It's also really important that you keep track of where all your parts are if you're going to use them again. I gave the underside of the base a little scratch so that I could see whether it was solid brass or not, and it isn't. And I don't even think the gooseneck had a brass coating on it. I think it was more of a yellowish varnish, which I was able to take off very easily with a nylon brush. And I gave the underside of the cover the same treatment. When I brushed the base enough to get rid of the pitting and the corrosion, it took the brass plating right off, but I didn't think there was any way of avoiding that. And then I took the swirl marks out with a sanding sponge. This is typical of the kind of planning drawing that I do. It's supposed to depict a cylinder that houses the wiring at the top and three hollow octagonal prisms that are nesting inside each other. But it's sometimes easier to understand what's going on if you know where you're going, so here's a preview. The lampshades are made from oak that I reclaimed from a 100-year-old piano that was really beyond repair. Here I'm roughing out the cylinder for the top of the lampshade. This is the threaded rod that I'm going to use to turn the cylinder into shape, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to drill a hole in the blank that's too big to house the existing hardware that came with the lamp. I put the roughed out blank in a box so that it could rotate along its vertical axis, and then I use a router with a straight cutting bit to cut the cylinder. It really took a lot longer than this. I'm just using a little bit of movie magic. I set this jig up on my drill press to sand the cylinder. I started with 60 grit, went to 120 grit, and then to 220 grit. This is actually the blank for two of the cylinders because there are two lampshades. At this point, the pressure of the vise started pinching the saw. It's obviously very important when you're drilling something like this to clamp it onto your drill press. You definitely don't want to be holding that by hand. The purpose of this step is to make the cylinders hollow so they can house the electrical hardware. This is a screen capture from my phone of a calculator that allowed me to enter the diagonal of the octagon I was trying to make, and it gave me the length of the side that I needed to cut. I started by ripping the oak from the old piano into 1x2s. And by that, I mean an actual 1 inch by 2 inch piece of wood. Then I took a diagonal cut off the long side of each 1x2. That would be the taper of the outside of the octagon. The next step was to cut a very large rabbet out of the piece of wood, leaving really only 1/4 of an inch in the shape of an L profile. At this point, I think I should tell you that my background is in art, and my training really consisted of a philosophy that when you're designing something, you try it out, and if it doesn't work, then you adjust it. Even though I thought I had calculated the diameter of the octagons so that one would fit inside the next, it didn't work. I might have missed something mathematically, but I think it's more likely that I cut the sides of the octagons inaccurately. So I shortened the bottom piece thinking it would increase the diameter, but in fact it only increased the outside diameter. The inside diameter stayed the same. It still didn't fit. I set my saw blade to a 10-degree angle and tapered the bottom part of the middle octagon. You can't see it in this shot, but I actually drew a line on the table saw surface so that I could line up my piece with the blade. It was so close at this point that I decided to thin the edges of the bottom octagon, since it was showing a thicker profile than it had because I had cut the top off it. Then I carefully chiseled out a bevel on the inside edge of the octagon wall. I thought my octagons were too round and it made them look bulky, so I decided to cut a section out of the middle. I made this jig to guide me in cutting out a 1 inch section of the pointed part of the octagon. I just want to tell you that I'm really enjoying the process of making these videos. I'm going to be doing it on a regular basis. And if you're enjoying what you're seeing, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. Just click the subscribe button. It doesn't cost anything, and the only effect is that whenever I make a new video, you'll be informed that it's ready to watch. This is the smallest of the 3 octagons. It's the only one that doesn't have a taper. After the glue set on the new narrower octagons, I also applied some wood filler to all the cracks, and once that set up, I sanded all of the sharp edges smooth. At this point, I got the idea that if I put the octagons inside each other, but slightly canted, they would actually create the same effect as the original lampshade, in that they would be longer on one side than they are on the other. So here I am mocking it up with spacers and double-sided tape to make sure that once the whole thing is put together, it actually will still be able to fit a light bulb into it. It's not the most precise method, but it was close enough that I discovered I actually would be able to fit a light bulb in there. I used a router bit with a bearing on it to round over the top edge of the cylinder that is going to house the electrical components. And I put these 2x4s on to guide it, because it's really very likely when you're routing something round that it can send it spinning. Lighting fixtures are often assembled with these threaded cylinders that are hollow for the wires to go through them. The one that I'm taking apart here is for the top of the lamp shade that I'm making. But the goosenecks actually had the threaded cylinder built right in, not removable. They aren't very long because the original lampshade is very thin, but I had to make sure that the threaded rod would go all the way through the cylinder. So I countersunk it for the width of the gooseneck, and then drilled a hole all the way through for the length of the threaded rod. And here I am drilling a hole just the right diameter for the threaded rod that holds the light socket. I'm using these cutouts as spacers so that I can glue the octagons together. The reason I used an L-shaped profile is for strength, but also to create a surface that I could glue the octagons together. And then these wedges are going to be glued in between the octagons to give them strength. I'm just marking out the layout using tape so that once I get the glue on, I don't have to fiddle around with placing the cylinder. I want to point out that I'm able to use wood to make the lampshade because I'm intending to only use LED bulbs, which don't get hot. If I were using an incandescent bulb, I would never make a lampshade out of wood. I'm just dry fitting the wedges that I'm using to connect the top two pieces to the bottom two pieces. Once the lampshades were glued up and dry, I sanded them and then gave them a coat of a water-based urethane that has a stain built into it called golden oak. After 3 coats of urethane, I sanded the lampshades very lightly with 400 grit before applying a 4th coat. This is gold acrylic paint, and I used it to paint the inside of the lampshades. I wanted to paint the metal parts with acrylic paint as well, but you can't use artist acrylics directly on metal. They scrape off too easily. So I primed it with black automotive paint first. I'm going to paint a circular pattern on the base. So I laid this tape out on the plastic, and I'm making 3 different sizes of circles. Then I'm going to cut them out with an X-Acto knife and stick them down on the base to use as a guide. I'm trying to create a random arrangement, so I'm making sure to avoid symmetrical placement of the circles. A thin layer of burnt sienna paint over the black will make the base look like it's rusted. I'm using a small quantity of paint and scrubbing it on in a dry brush technique so that I get soft edges, and I'm not taking the paint all the way up to the edge of the tape so that I get a sort of fuzzy ring that's later going to look a little bit like a shadow. Next, I'm going to apply 3 golden circles offset from the black ones so that they look like they're casting a shadow on the base. This paint is quite transparent, so it needs 3 or 4 coats to make it look solid. When you're dry brushing, you have to use a very small amount of paint and really scrub it on there, and that gives you the look of a patina. Once the acrylic paint was dry, which doesn't take very long, I applied a single coat of water-based clear urethane. The urethane is tougher than the acrylic paint, and so it'll protect it from being scratched. Once all the parts were prepared, I just needed to reassemble them. Serious design flaw. I couldn't get my hand inside the lampshade to put the nut on the other side of the threaded cylinder. Fortunately, my wife could. Here's the original classic lamp. Here's the finished product, an admittedly unusual take on a mid-century modern double gooseneck desk lamp. Click like, click subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think.